With the church's rapid growth, it had to expand feast facilities. Large tents and metal buildings were used in various locations to accommodate the tens of thousands of feastgoers. For those attending for the first time in Mount Pocono in 1967, high winds
shook the tent and blew out the lights. We were in the dark. And so it was decided to build what they would call a metal tent.
George Evans designed the first metal tent that went up in Mount Pocono, Pennsylvania.
It was enough to seat 10,000 people. We wound up having as many as 15,000 people there for the feast as we were growing so much.
The metal tents were constructed for several other feast sites as well, until halls and convention centers proved to be more affordable and convenient around the world.
I think one of the major ways that things have changed is that when we go to the feast nowadays, we're pretty comfortable. And we normally don't camp out somewhere like we did back in those early years. Normally, we stay in some pretty nice places.
Those nice places bring us together to learn God's way and His plan of salvation. We continue to this day answering the question, why are we here?
It's where we concentrate and focus on the Bible, the kingdom, the resurrection.
I never ever want to lose that zeal and desire and thirst for God's truth, which we can keep eternally going through the feast.
So every year, every holy day, we should reflect on the question, why am I here? What brought me here? Why am I doing this? What is my purpose in keeping this feast, in walking this way of life? And when we answer that, we see that we fit in to an entire history of humanity. We are today a link in a long chain. And we are part of preserving that chain that has gone before us, and we will be a link to the future as well. And we must see the importance of our role in the Church of God today in that light. Even our being here and being baptized made us part of a link in a chain, because part of baptism was having the laying on of hands. If you were baptized, you had hands laid on you by someone who had hands laid on them, by someone who had hands laid on them, all the way down the line back to the time of Jesus Christ and the establishing of the church. There's a connection there that comes with that ceremony. Christ said, I will build my church. And He did, and He has preserved it. Christ said the gates of hell will never prevail against that church. And they haven't. But the gates of hell have beat on that church. The gates of hell have presented some times of trial. The gates of hell have damaged that church from time to time. But Christ promised that. God has preserved it and kept it alive. And one of the great blessings that He has given us in this day is the knowledge of His holy days and His festivals. And so today, 75 years later, at a time in an area where the church in this modern time began to be revived in a powerful way with only a handful of people, just a little tiny handful of people. Today, we have 5, even 6 generations keeping the feast. That's amazing. That's remarkable. And now we have thousands of people. We have generations. And that's wonderful, but it also poses a challenge. And that is that every succeeding generation to come needs to be careful not to take that for granted. Not to take it for granted, because we don't remember what it was like to be pioneers. We never were there. We don't understand the sacrifices, but we cannot fail to appreciate the impact of the Feast of Tabernacles and to cling to our roots and to appreciate what it took for us to be here and what God was doing and how people were responding to God. It took a long time, and we have this treasure, and each succeeding generation must cling to that heritage. We have a heritage that allows us to identify with heroes in the past. And our heroes go back thousands of years. Now, what are we connected to with God's people throughout history more than anything else? The number one thing we will have in common with all of God's people throughout time is the kingdom of God. It's the kingdom of God. And so what is pictured in the feast itself has always been a great heritage of God's people. Tremendous heritage. And I guess there's probably no greater place to consider the explanation of that than in Hebrews chapter 11. We often call this the faith chapter, but in preparation for this sermon, I think I'm going to add to it the heritage chapter. Because it is our heritage. We are linked to all of these people. In verse 8, we read, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would afterward receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Now, where was he going to find that city? Just over the next hill, maybe? What was this meaning to Abraham? Was he really looking for an actual physical city? No, this is describing something that was in the heart of Abraham. Abraham knew that God was working something great in his life, something that would happen only long after he was gone physically, in which the physical promises would be really fulfilled. But something very important had entered Abraham's life and his thinking. And what is amazing is that we share the same thing with him. In chapter 11 and verse 13, it says, "These all," now we've just read about Abraham, but there are other people in there, "all of them died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth." We all share the same mind as Abraham and the others mentioned here. It's part of the heritage that goes along with being the people of God. Now, this concept that we go on to read in verse 14 is profound. "For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland." This concept of seeking a homeland, another homeland, is life-changing. It doesn't matter how long you live. It doesn't matter where you live. No matter what you go through, even death, nothing changes your faith because of a step-by-step process that has altered your thinking forever. Now, these steps are described here. We've already read them in verse 13 and 14. Number one, they did not receive the fulfillment of the promises. They are coming later, but they did know what was promised. They knew what was promised. This is a heritage of the church. We know what is promised. We've shared that with people, the people of God, forever. God calls us, and He delivers promises to us. The cycle that we go through of the holy days and the feast every year reminds us of the promises of what has happened in the past and what is going to happen in the future. What is to come? In verse 13, we see the second thing mentioned. Having seen them afar off. This is why the feasts are so important to us. They remind us of the promises and they help us to envision them. We read prophecies and then we see them. We read them and then we see them in our mind's eye. Having seen the promises afar off, were assured of them, embraced them. In other words, it wasn't just an academic study of prophecy. They embraced them. The Greek means to enfold in the arms. Enfold in the arms. In today's vernacular, we might say we wrapped our minds around it.